Welcome to Regulating the Revolution, AI, Blockchain, and the Future of Policy. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm really encouraged that there's such a strong interest in this really important issue. I'd like to start out by thanking Urban Tech Exchange. They are a hands-on lab for tech providers, developers, educators, and researchers, and that is the beautiful venue that we're at tonight here. And I'd like to thank one of our big sponsors, Stand With Crypto. Stand With Crypto is a 501c3 C4 nonprofit, and they champion for clear, common sense regulations in the crypto industry. And they are mobilizing the 52 million crypto owners in the US to unlock crypto's innovation potential and foster economic freedom. And I have a second sponsor that we're very grateful to tonight. DAG, Digital Ascension Group, is the parent company of a syndicate of businesses and family offices that specialize in digital assets and offer bespoke solutions for a wide range of emerging technology businesses. And actually, I have Rick here, and could you share a little bit about DAG?
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you for that. And first off, thank you to everybody attending and watching online with us this evening. So to tell you a little bit about Digital Ascension Group, we are a syndicate of multifamily offices and businesses that specializes in crypto and digital assets. We have been in the crypto blockchain space since 2016, and that's a little bit about us.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to each of you for coming. I'm encouraged that there's so much strong interest in this topic. It's a critically important issue that will really shape the future of technology in our country. So to kick things off, we're going to get into it. We're going to dive into one of the most critical and rapidly evolving conversations in tech, regulatory frameworks in blockchain and AI. These technologies, they're not just revolutionizing industries, they're redefining privacy, security, and even power structures globally. The rules being written right now will determine how we govern decentralized systems, protect consumers, and manage ethical challenges in AI, from deepfakes to data privacy. How governments choose to regulate or not regulate these technologies could affect everything from the way we do business to the way we operate to national security risks. So our panel this evening is going to dive into one of those high stakes questions with a focus on the real legal and compliance challenges developers face today, as well as the ethical dilemmas that AI is creating. And it's really become a tug of war for who controls the future of tech, so it's a very important issue. And so, before we get into the first question, I would like to do some introductions of myself and the others. I'm Elizabeth Hansen. I am a community builder in tech, and I plan events around blockchain and AI. I'm also a CTO, a software engineer, and I'm a blockchain consultant actually since about 2016. So it's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I'm Rick Tapia, General Counsel for Digital Ascension Group. I'm also the co-founder of DraftChain AI, and we are a legal tech AI platform for attorneys. And I guess an easy way to think of us as ChatGPT for lawyers. That's a little about myself.
All right, everybody, thanks for having us here. My name is Nick Reese. I'm the co-founder, COO of Frontier Foundry. We're an artificial intelligence company producing privacy-preserving AI. So we actually have LLMs that don't require the cloud or the internet. And so before that, I had a long career in government, so a lot of Homeland Security, national security experience that we'll talk about tonight.
Hey everyone, my name is Mark Cianci. I am an attorney. I've been in practice for around 15 years. I have an office in Boston, and I'm partnered with 2 other attorneys in New York. We are a boutique that focuses on high-stakes business litigation, blockchain litigation, and blockchain strategic counseling for entrepreneurs, investors, and other participants in the blockchain economy.
Hi everyone, my name is Brandon Street, and I'm the CEO, co-founder of Creative Collab. We're an incubation company for NFT projects, and we like to solve problems as well. So a lot of Web 2 companies would like to have Web 3 technology, but they don't necessarily need to call themselves a Web 3 company. So we help them find that solution there.
Wonderful, thank you, Brandon. Okay, we're going to start our discussion tonight by talking about the regulatory frameworks that are being developed around blockchain and AI, both in Washington as well as globally. Rick, we're going to start with you, so we'll pass the microphone down to him. And I wanted to share, from my firsthand experience as a developer building in blockchain, navigating these regulations, these emerging regulations, is one of the biggest hurdles that really adds to the complexity of what we try to accomplish in technology. So I would love it if, Rick, if you could shed some light on how to overcome them. And my question specifically is, what do you foresee as the key challenges for developers with AI-driven decision-making in the context of blockchain and non-blockchain applications?
That's a really good question. So there's really two areas I'm going to kind of discuss kind of regarding some challenges with AI systems. And really the first one is going to be really focused on the quality of data that you have. And kind of zooming out a little bit when we think about AI, and I was talking about this with Nick a little bit earlier, AI companies really at the heart of what they are data companies. And the higher quality data that you have, the more likely amongst other factors you have to be actually create better outputs. And so I would say that's one really difficult challenge I see the AI industry currently going through, mostly because the data that is being used in a lot of these AI companies is scraped from all over the web. So Nick kind of has a really good analogy with this. It's like hitting kind of a broad target and expecting to get kind of a narrow answer. And so there's a reason why if you use some of these AI systems, you may ask it to do a specific task or give it a specific prompt, and you'll get a very broad answer. So as the data inside these AI systems becomes more refined over time, you'll start to see better systems in place. The second aspect I want to really kind of touch on, and this is kind of more of a broader theme that we're going to touch on a lot tonight, is really around accountability. And I think what that means is who's accountable for what not only these AI systems generate, but then who creates them, right? And kind of crossing over into the blockchain context, we see a lot of litigation and legal issues cropping up with companies and people who have developed different tools and technology systems that are utilized by people in sometimes bad contexts and sometimes in good contexts. So I think those are going to be some of the issues that developers are facing today.
That's really interesting, Rick. And I can tell you, I think I speak for a lot of engineers in this room when I say that the most important part of any project is really clear specifications. So, in order to be successful, clarity really has to be made on the requirements. And it almost seems that when you have a brand new technology, it's one step ahead of the laws that are meant to regulate it, which I think is part of the reason why things are so tricky right now, right? So this next question is actually for Nick. Now let's explore the government regulations around how AI specifically is evolving, particularly where they intersect with blockchain. I think that'll be very exciting for a lot of people in this crowd, because the rules are really going to impact how much freedom developers have to innovate. So my question for you is, how could AI-specific regulations potentially intersect with blockchain systems, particularly in areas like automated governments and decision-making?
Yeah, perfect. So just for a quick background, I was the Director of Emerging Technology at the Department of Homeland Security before I co-founded this company. And we worked on these policies and strategies and things like this, like at the White House and at these kind of higher levels of government. And really the question, Elizabeth, the US was a question about convergence. And so convergence is when you have more than one technology that you bring together to create a capability that is larger than the pieces that it was made from. And so you can think of AI as a converging technology, as in it can be integrated into several different applications. And so if you are going to have, if you have a large data set, back to kind of what Rick was talking about, it's just a data set, it's just a data set until you put the analytics and things like that on top of it to make it into something that is usable intuitively. Well, now it's no longer a data set, is it? Now it's an AI application. And so I think the first where I want to start this answer is with the idea of convergence. So if we're going to bring AI and blockchain together, we're creating a converging technology kind of system here, right? So then if we're going to talk about kind of what the policy environment, the regulatory environment looks like, what I would say is it's most useful to look kind of over time at the different policies that have come out to understand kind of like where the momentum is going. And so with AI, you can go way back to some of these earlier executive orders, from the last presidential administration, one of which was Executive Order 13960, which was about trustworthy principles for the use of AI in the federal government. And you look at how the policy is building since then. And that gives you an idea of, is it really disconnected? Is it contiguous? Are we kind of on a path towards something that makes sense? And you saw in President Biden's executive order, there was a call for regulation for AI, but not to any agencies that have the regulatory authority to do it. So they wanted DHS to do it. DHS doesn't have that authority in statute. So there's quite a bit of work to be done to make that happen. But you are seeing a lot of support to these emerging technologies coming out. So I would say that blockchain will be affected by it to the extent that it is integrated into blockchain applications, and that convergence concept will become really important here.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you, Nick. AI is developing at such a staggering pace, and so it's already presenting these legal challenges that we've never faced before. And would you even say that there is less regulation for AI at this point than there is for blockchain?
Yes, because really the places that we're seeing regulation with AI are places where there's existing regulatory regimes. And so, if you're already in a regulated industry, you probably have some kind of AI regulation that you have to deal with.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so
That makes
that's
sense.
mostly where that exists. But to like this kind of big, broad, monolithic, kind of like the EU AI Act, right? Like some big piece of legislation that's going to regulate like all of AI, we don't have that. But we do have it in places where there are already regulatory regimes.
Thank you. Okay, this next question is actually for Rick. What are some of the emerging legal issues with AI as a whole that we are seeing now that, and we might also see in the future?
Yeah, there's a lot. And there's many more issues that are coming into the fold. So the first aspect that I'll touch on is regarding victimless crimes. And what I mean by that is, and I know this is a bit of a heavy topic to kind of discuss, but when you think about, child pornography and when we see today now that you have AI systems that can actually generate, child pornography without an actual child that is, a living child being depicted, how do you handle that from a criminal perspective and from, sitting here if you're a judge or if you're sitting in a courthouse, right? How do you look at this? Do you have liability that passes on to the development company that allowed for this to be created? Is there obviously liability at the hands of the end user who actually created it or prompted the AI to create it? And then you also look in the context of also, victim crimes related to AI. Just yesterday, I just read an article about a young 14-year-old boy who was communicating with an AI chatbot. And over time, he started to develop romantic feelings for this chatbot and got to the point where he isolated himself from his friends, from his family, from school. And unfortunately, this young man ended up taking his own life. And subsequently, his family has now actually filed a complaint against that AI company for not having the proper guardrails in place for situations. Issues kind of. There's also issues related to more traditional legal related matters such as intellectual property, data privacy. Obviously, as Nick was kind of touching on, cross-jurisdictional issues. Obviously in the day and age of the internet, where you can try to silo off liability to certain countries and do things like geofencing, it's still very hard to enforce and have a uniform system in place for issues like this.
That's a really good example of why, whether we think we love or hate regulation, why it's actually so important, right? So, you brought up a really sobering example of why regulating AI is important. For blockchain, we can think back on FTX, right? So there are reasons that we really should want good, common sense, supportive regulation. So, the global nature of both AI and blockchain regulation means that it doesn't exist in a silo, right? So different countries are taking very different approaches. And so I have another question for you actually concerning this. How do you see governments responding to cross-border challenges in AI regulation, especially with decentralized technologies like blockchain?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I really don't think we have a really solid answer yet. And I know Mark could probably shed some more light on this as well from a litigation perspective, but we really don't have a clear answer yet. I mean, we have one set of countries that are really friendly to cryptocurrency and blockchain-based businesses and tokenization. Other countries that are not so much. Probably one of the ones that we're sitting in right here. Right now, they're not the most friendly towards crypto and blockchain, but that also might be changing. From a policy and regulatory perspective, with this election coming up, I think really crypto is on the ballot, and I think it's really important, just not to go off on a tangent on this, but for people to really be informed about what their local legislators and their federal legislators, where they really stand on crypto, and really kind of understand the issues. So yeah, to answer your question, I think really the heart of the matter is, can we create some sort of uniform guidelines for companies to follow, regardless of wherever their jurisdiction is? And I think we're getting there. You're starting to see some sandboxes come into the fold where different countries are building out these regulatory sandboxes and testing out the technology and use cases. But we also have a long way to go, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely we do. So I think we're just at the beginning. And, okay, actually, let's move on to the next topic, unless there was something that you wanted to say. No? Okay. We've just explored the shifting landscape of regulations, but the real challenge for developers and all those building in the space is being compliant. And making sure that your projects are compliant, which is very difficult to do when these specifications are not super clear. So for those building in the blockchain space, especially with AI involved, compliance is where things can get very messy and also very costly, actually. So understanding how to tackle issues like KYC and AML, token classification, and data validation in both blockchain and AI integrated applications really could be the difference between success on your projects and major legal setbacks that can break a company, especially startups. So it's really important to be informed on these issues. And Rick, I have a question for you on this. How could AI streamline or maybe complicate traditional compliance in both the crypto and the non-crypto world?
Yeah, and I definitely want to get Mark's thoughts on this as well. But when we think about AI and KYC and AML compliance, in a lot of ways, AI can provide a lot of streamlined solutions for this process. Where the problem comes in my opinion, is much like humans, AIs also have bias as well. If you think about it, humans are the ones programming and training and providing context to these AI systems, so it's only logical to conclude that the AI also is going to have this as well. Mm-hmm. And when you obviously expand that out on a cross-jurisdictional basis where there's a lot of aspects of different rules and regulations and reporting mechanisms in different states and countries, it can be very problematic very quickly. So I'd like to think someday in the future we can streamline a lot of these processes with AI, but we certainly have a little bit of a ways to go.
I would agree with you. Thank you, Rick. And actually, yes, we're going to turn to Mark for this next question, and you can also expand on that if you'd like. You're definitely the guy for this, actually. So let's dive into the legal liabilities that developers face, especially around broker-dealer concerns and compliance with AI-driven systems. So Mark, my specific question for you is, what are the legal liabilities developers face with AI-enhanced platforms like Uniswap, Ether Delta, especially regarding liquidity management?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So it's interesting you bring up Uniswap. So maybe I'll discuss that in a few different lights and then extrapolate from that what some developers should be thinking about based on the current treatment. So Uniswap actually has 3 parallel litigation proceedings, all either recently resolved or still ongoing. There is a federal SEC investigation of Uniswap that was noticed to Uniswap by virtue of a Wells notice. Uniswap received that and was you don't have to publicize receipt of such a notice, and you certainly don't have to publicize your response. Oftentimes, those are filed confidentially. But in this instance, Uniswap went and hired a very well-acclaimed lawyer in the crypto scene who had actually litigated on behalf of Grayscale in connection with the GBTC Trust, and filed a response to the SEC explaining in extensive detail why the alleged securities law violations regarding Uniswap were unfounded. One of the key data points for that response relates to a second proceeding involving Uniswap. This one brought by a user of the protocol. Everyone here is familiar with Uniswap as a service? Is that true? Great. Sweet. So we all know how Uniswap works, right? You're a random user, you hold one coin, you want to get a different coin, you interact with the protocol. But unlike centralized exchanges, the coins are never in the custody of Uniswap. Uniswap is really just creating programs, and it happens to also have an interface, but it's not maintaining those programs, it's not maintaining the underlying programming for the interface. That's just created and launched out into the world. And so one of the users of Uniswap exchanged their Ethereum, which is valuable, for a bunch of scam tokens. And this happened several times. They collectively sued Uniswap on a class basis, alleging that Uniswap was liable for the decline in the price of their tokens. Well, that's interesting because Uniswap didn't create the tokens. Uniswap didn't have any direct relationship to the tokens other than that they launched some computer code that allowed the users to make that exchange. That was the exact argument that Uniswap leveraged in its motion to dismiss. And the judge in the Southern District of New York, actually the same judge that is overseeing the case against Coinbase by the SEC, agreed with Uniswap and dismissed the case, saying that there were no securities law violations, even if you assumed, without deciding, that the underlying scam tokens were securities, there were still no securities law violations on the part of Uniswap. The third proceeding, which I'll just touch on very briefly, but I mentioned it because it actually is a contradiction of sorts. Uniswap, just last month, settled charges by the CFTC and paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in connection with that settlement for alleged facilitation of transfers of commodity swaps and commodity derivatives in violation of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission's regulations. Well, that's interesting because if it's not operating as a securities exchange and it just won a federal judge's decision on that point, then how is it also simultaneously operating as a commodities exchange? So you even have the same platform, the same set of programs coming out in two different outcomes. So that's a bit of a long-winded wind-up to get to the meat of your question, which is, okay, against that backdrop, with just one protocol, what is a developer to do? And this is very intense for me because I literally had this conversation with a prospective client play out over the past week. Client's got a new idea that has a lot of similarities in some senses to what Uniswap is coming out with. And they said, Mark, we're new, we haven't yet raised. We would love for you to be able to advise us regarding some of the legal and compliance landscapes. I gave them a budget, and it was a very streamlined budget. And they said, oh, that's not something that we can afford at this very moment. And if I had a dime for every time I had that conversation with a client, I wouldn't have needed to charge this new client anything because I'd have a lot of dimes. I mean, this is literally the exact struggle that many developers are going through. And unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer in terms of a solution. Oftentimes, there are creative arrangements that can be aligned with between the lawyer and the client, whether that's the lawyer taking a small position in the client or getting creative with their fees. But the solution is never, from my perspective, just to skip the compliance discussion altogether, because that can in turn create a system of uncertainty going forward. But that's, at least in a nutshell, one response there.
Yeah, and I just want to echo Mark's sentiments actually as well to that point. You know, when I was in private practice and working with a lot of blockchain-based companies, I had very similar conversations. And the stark economic reality hits when you tell a client, hey, it's going to cost you this much to do it, and the other reality is that you're going to have to do this offshore. And for us as a country saying that, hey, you have a great business idea, but you have to take it offshore, it really pains me as somebody who is, an American and wants American businesses to stay here. But, and to Mark's point as well, not every, startup has $40,000 or $50,000 in legal fees to launch out their product, and really, quite frankly, they shouldn't have to. But the current regulatory environment says you pretty much have to, or you're not going to get off the ground.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark, you're talking about Uniswap being charged for the way some of their users were using their software in ways that weren't intended. And as a builder in the decentralized space, that's really scary to think about, creating open source software for the good of society, and then some nefarious user using it for an unintended purpose, and then me being personally held accountable. And that's also, something new that I think we're seeing with, the Storm case of a citizen being charged in a criminal matter like this, if I have that correct. But
Are you talking about Tornado Cash?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with Tornado Cash. Yeah, so it's really unsettling thinking about building in the decentralized space and then possibly being held responsible for something somebody decides to do with your software. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny that you bring up this concept of you create something and then you release it into the world, because hearkening back to Uniswap, that was the exact analogy that was made by both sides before the judge. The plaintiff, the user of the protocol, said, this is as if you created a self-driving car and then the self-driving car got released out into the world and was manufactured poorly and created accidents. And the defendant said, no, it's not. It's as if we created a self-driving car, it operates correctly, but the person who then decides to rent out the self-driving car uses it to purposefully create a crash or to purposefully do something nefarious. And in that particular case, the judge endorsed that reasoning. Tornado Cash is the complete opposite. And there's also another case going on. Tornado Cash is obviously an Ethereum-based mixer. There's Bitcoin Fog, which is a fog-based mixer. And there have been parallel proceedings. They're one slightly ahead of the other, but both going against the founders, who happen to have the same first name, as if we're not living in a simulation. And those theories, which are even more coercive than the civil case brought against Uniswap, because these are criminal prosecutions where the developer's freedom is at stake, and in the case of Bitcoin Fog, has already been found guilty. These are extremely scary propositions for developers. Now, I don't want to be too doom and gloom, because it is a well-known, non-secret in the industry that a very common application of Mixer and Tumblr applications is to avoid money laundering restrictions. And in fact, going back to the Uniswap case, the fact that the protocol could be used for a ton of things that were entirely valid and were not illegal was one of the rationales that the judge anchored their endorsement of the legality of the protocol in the Uniswap case, whereas in the Mixers and Tumblr's case, there's at least more of a shadow of potential liability. But that's really a small glimmer of hope in the overall scheme of things, because the same core activity, which is I create something and I release it out into the world and it runs on a self-executing level, I am not maintaining it, I am not profiting from it on an ongoing basis, and yet I'm still liable. That should, and rightly does, send some very strong shivers down the spines of the development community.
Yeah, this has really gotten to be quite a controversial issue with token classification, and it has, resulted in a massive litigation battle, with Ripple, with Terra Labs, and this could really reshape the future of crypto regulation. So if you could briefly touch on how can companies mitigate this? How can they mitigate these risks dealing with token classification in such, an uncertain regulatory environment?
Yeah, I think there are at least two answers in part to that. So one of them is what we saw successfully in Uniswap, where the court didn't even have to addressed that thorny question of the underlying classification of the tokens that were being exchanged. The court said in the civil case brought by the private plaintiff, doesn't matter, it's not a securities law violation anyway. Now, in the cases against the centralized exchanges, and there are many, that question is unavoidable, because in these centralized exchange cases, the exchanges are taking custody, and they are operationally exercising core functions that, if the underlying asset is a security, would be subject to the securities laws. So in that scheme, and you brought up a couple of them, last year we had, from the same court, two different judges, but within the same court in the Southern District of New York, within a few weeks of each other, two polar opposite decisions. One, in the Ripple case, concluding that secondary sales of tokens, even if they would have been securities when they were primarily issued, were not securities transactions on the secondary market. That's in the Ripple case. Then a few weeks later, there was a judge in the Terraform case that concluded exactly the opposite on the secondary trading issue, said that they were not persuaded that that was an appropriate differentiation, and that Terraform case just earlier this year resulted in a $4 billion fraud verdict against Terraform. Now, we would probably, as a community, endorse the result there in terms of, yeah, that was, everyone agrees, a scam in many senses, but the tension in the law is concerning. Now we have 4 cases against centralized exchanges, Kraken, Binance, Coinbase, and most recently, Crypto.com got a Wells notice, and rather than waiting for the SEC to sue Crypto.com, Crypto.com affirmatively went out and sued the SEC, which is a bold move, but one that I was very happy to see and enjoyed reading their complaint, basically saying that the SEC lacks the authority. And we can get all nerdy around the Chevron case, which had given agencies a high degree of deference in how they interpreted their governing regulations. That was overturned by the Supreme Court recently, and there's this additional groundswell of challenges by regulated entities against the regulators. And so Crypto.com is an example of that. But I guess stepping back, because I don't want to bore us with too many details on these cases, stepping back, it just illustrates that the landscape is incredibly uncertain. Kraken filed a motion to dismiss, denied. Coinbase filed something similar, a motion for judgment on the pleadings, denied. Binance filed a motion to dismiss, largely denied. So those cases are proceeding, and we'll see what happens in the Crypto.com affirmative case against the SEC. It should be a fun thing to observe.
That's really insightful, and it's really fascinating hearing from somebody who's inside the industry and in the legal way. So fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us, Mark. Let's move on to enforcement challenges, because we've just covered the complex world of compliance, but even when companies try to follow the rules, enforcement is where things get really interesting and actually surprisingly controversial. So we're diving into how governments are trying to keep up with enforcement of both blockchain and AI, especially in terms of privacy, NFTs, and platforms like Tornado Cash, which came up. So this next question is for Nick. And these enforcement challenges really could set a major precedence, which is why it's so critical that we get this right. So my question for you is, how can AI-driven platforms maintain compliance while upholding user privacy in decentralized networks?
Yeah, so when we're talking about compliance with regulatory frameworks and things like that, that's really, especially if you're a developer, that is a future-facing question. You should not be thinking about the regulatory environment as it exists today. You should be thinking about it as you can see it evolve into the future. And so let's go back to Rick's earlier comments about data. And so if you're an AI developer or something like that, and you have data that you're working with, you can see what the policies, some of the state laws, some of the the EU laws and things like that. You can see what kind of the direction that's starting to go. And I'm not saying to make wild guesses. You want to make very educated guesses, but you want to look at regulatory compliance or compliance kind of you want to future-proof yourself. And so, for going back to the data example, are we going to be able to just kind of dump all data into these, kind of big, massive, cloud native multi-party cloud AI tools, there's probably going to be some kind of limitation, and there already are limitations in some of the regulated industries, but are we going to be able to continue to do that? Probably not. Now, how long will it take? That's a bit of a question. But when you're thinking about building your tools and you're thinking about how to think about compliance, think about compliance not necessarily as it exists today, but as you can see the momentum as it's moving forward. So that's what I was referring to with looking at these, the kind of entire corpus of, whether they're, executive orders or even like EU laws or things like that. You can see the momentum. Pay attention to that and build kind of with that the future proofing in mind, because if you don't get your product out for another year, you might end up kind of missing on the engineering side something that is now in policy that you have to comply with. So always think of that as think ahead of where the regulatory environment is today.
Could you mention just briefly what type of enforcement actions you think we will see in light of Tornado Cash?
So to be clear, right, we're talking about actions that are within an existing regulatory regime. We're not talking about a broad-based, regulation against blockchain as a whole or AI as a whole. So I teach on the side, and I've got students from different countries, and this is always a fun conversation with them, because it's really interesting where the way that the U.S. looks at regulations and enforcement and the way that Europe looks at it. And so if you look at Europe, Europe has the EU AI Act, they have GDPR, they have these different acts. They're these big monolithic laws that kind of cover everything. And their view is something bad might happen, so we should go ahead and regulate. But the US's view is something bad has happened 17 times, now maybe we'll regulate, but we'll regulate lightly. Mm-hmm. Right, so the U.S. has a very different kind of view on how this kind of unfolds. So in terms of the enforcement actions, I mean, I think we've seen a couple of things, and Mark talked about it, perfectly here with some of these different cases. So I do think we'll see a tightening of it, but exactly what that looks like, I think remains to be seen, because again, when we have some cases that are being dismissed and some cases that are proceeding, and we have very these cases that are kind of in flight right now, I think that really is going to determine what the enforcement actions look like once that precedent is set.
Can I pick up on that, or?
Yeah, and I have a question coming up for you as well.
Okay, so I'll pick up on that, and then I'll take the question. So yeah, you mentioned these EU-wide regulatory schemes, and the other one specific to crypto and blockchain is MiCA. And MiCA has now been adopted at an EU level and is being implemented on a country-by-country level at a rapid pace, because the adoption order requires that it be adopted quickly. And what's very interesting is we are seeing companies now that have a US presence, but that also have a European presence and maybe also have a presence in Asia and other parts of the world. They are using MiCA as their framework, because it's very hard if you're a company to have a bunch of different compliance systems and a bunch of different compliance requirements across various jurisdictions. You're a company, you want to have uniformity. So what we're starting to see in America, it's still at the earlier phases, but the American vacuum of legislation and regulation is paving the way for American businesses to, by default, really just by inertia, become not actively legally subject to, but as a practical matter, subject to significant regulation that's being orchestrated by the EU, which is interesting, and you can talk about whether that's good or bad, but at least from the perspective of self-governance, it's not the way it's supposed to work.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. So let's talk about actually enforcement in the context of autonomous AI-driven smart contracts, because this is actually a great example of how AI and blockchain can work together. So how do you see governments enforcing regulations when the software itself is designed to operate autonomously, which we just touched on a bit ago?
Yeah, so I won't repeat what I said about the tumblers and mixers, but there are obviously other self-executing functions that exist as on the basis of blockchain. And then even related to that, there are decentralized autonomous organizations whose entire legal structure or lack thereof is designed to avoid the need for active governance by an entity and really designed to allow the decentralization that's embedded in the blockchain ethos more broadly to apply specifically to a group of individuals. And so in that context, we've actually seen actions by private litigants and by government entities against DAOs. And one of the premier, in terms of headline grabbing, actions against a DAO was brought by the CFTC last year or the year before, and has been playing out in recent months, against a DAO that made certain products that the CFTC characterized as derivatives available to customers that, if you conceive of those products as derivatives, shouldn't have had access to those. And this called different things, BZX or UKI. And one of the main defenses launched by that DAO was, well, it's not us. We aren't a legal entity, and so you can't tag this entity with this alleged violation. We're just a system of self-executing contracts and self-executing structures. And then the court said, okay, well, if it's not you, who is it? And I'm going to actually potentially enforce liability against all the members of the DAO. And that's a very scary thing for a lot of us who are DAO members, and we wouldn't want to be considered subject to personal liability or liability of our LLC that we own for something that's happening completely outside our control at an organizational level at the DAO. So we have seen both, and this spans both private litigation and, more to your question, at an enforcement level, we have seen regulators and private citizens go after DAOs that are supposed to be autonomous and yet importing more classical notions of say a Delaware corporate structure and fiduciary duties and respondeat superior, employer liable for the conduct of its employees, importing those concepts that, yes, have remained true for hundreds of years in other spheres, but don't map on very well to the more self-executing forms of governance. We're seeing courts grapple with how to address that, and not to be a broken record, but it's not exactly consistent.
So what would you say to people who say that, you know, the SEC's history of who they go after suggests that they aren't putting the real effort into going after the nefarious players who are doing a rug pull on consumers, for instance, or otherwise really aren't protecting the public as they should, but instead are chasing the big fines from the big players, right? Who are often a lot of these are actually pretty transparent with your consumers, these larger companies, but I'm just asking for a friend, not for myself. But
Yeah,
you know.
it's funny because 2 years ago, there was a much different version of that question, which is, why is the SEC only going after the little guy? Why are they not going after the big guys? And I guess the SEC heard that and decided to go after
Yeah.
the big guys. But no, I think it's a really fascinating exploration of what's really completely non-legal and non-political in nature, but really goes more to the function of an organization. So the SEC is a group of humans. We all have our own aspirations that we're trying to achieve, and the folks within the SEC are humans who have their own aspirations, and they're led by a human, and the commission itself is 5 humans. Well, what does human nature have to do with any of this? Well, there's incentives around publicity, there's incentives around headline grabbing, actions and steps that can be taken that can then be used to propel the careers of some of these individuals. So I think part of the reason that we've seen a shift away from just the small guy who wasn't really hurting anyone to the big guy who still isn't really hurting anyone is a desire to have increased notoriety and perhaps a bit of the agency hearing from the community. But what has remained consistent in that question across a few years is that there are still tons of the actual bad actors getting away with it. And I think the reason for that is many of the bad actors are external to the United States, but are taking actions in the United States because so much of this technology just isn't border-proof. And so if the actors are not within the United States, there's very little that can be done about them. Moreover, oftentimes the actors become insolvent very quickly, or they are hidden behind a series of shell companies that are hard to penetrate. And so at a functional level, those folks are getting away with it, and it's wrong, and it shouldn't be happening. And if you're talking about allocation of agency resources, more, in my opinion, should be devoted to solving that problem. It currently isn't happening.
Yeah, I mean, the big guys versus the little guys. I don't want the little guys to get sued either. Because the thing is, you get sued by the SEC, and this takes your company out. Who can afford the legal fees for such a massive battle? And that's kind of heartbreaking to see a lot of the companies who've gone under just for that, for trying to follow rules that you don't hear about until you get sued. So it can be very frustrating. So thank you for addressing that. And I'd like to move on to Brandon, actually. Let's shift to the NFT space, because I know we have a lot of NFT creators right here in Detroit. I think they would be eager to hear your insight. Let's talk about NFT, because this is where, you have AI-driven platforms. They're really pushing the boundaries of digital art, and enforcement is struggling to keep up, of course. So the challenge here could help redefine how we protect intellectual property and manage decentralized ecosystems. So my question for you is, what are the enforcement challenges for AI-driven platforms?
Yeah, I would say time is the biggest thing. I think that there's just so much time in between being able to have proper regulation to go to these AI platforms and then to get them developed. A lot of these AI platforms are being built on AI as well. So that increases the amount of time and speed that these platforms are popping up, and the regulation is still on blockchain, and then AI just comes out of nowhere, right? So I think that's a big thing. I think that's the number one factor, to be honest.
That's really insightful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon. So we've just tackled the challenges of enforcement, and now we're going to dive into the complex and highly debated space, AI's role in legal and ethical issues. So with AI systems making decisions in legal tech, this next question is going to be for Rick. With these decisions, from drafting contracts to generating judgments, who holds the responsibilities when things go wrong? Again, we're asking that question. So Rick, what are some of the issues that you are seeing with attorneys and other legal practitioners who are using generative AI and other tools in their practice?
Yeah, I think there's so many issues going on that I think any board of ethics in a state bar association would probably puke, unfortunately. But the reality is just because there is not clear guidelines, much like kind of the overall theme of our discussion is lack of clear regulations and oversight. It's very much the case with attorneys utilizing AI in their practice. There's a lot of issues around client confidentiality. There's a lot of issues around trusting whatever it is that an AI is outputting in a given scenario. There was a case more recently of attorneys who were using ChatGPT to formulate a complaint. And when they filed the complaint with the court came back and said, hey, a couple of cases in here that you cited are not actually in existence. Can you go back and double check your work? And of course, the attorney's like, yeah, I'll take it back and I'll review it. So what does the attorney do? He goes back to ChatGPT and asks, hey, can you give me all of the information on the cases that you gave me that I filed in my complaint? And of course, ChatGPT made up a bunch of facts and rules and other things that were for that case, and the attorney took it back, refiled it again, and this time actually got reprimanded for it. So let that just be kind of a lesson that, hey, as a practitioner, make sure that you're double checking anything that comes out of an AI system that you're utilizing. And then again, make sure that you're also being aware that these systems have flaws in them and they're not to be completely trusted. Now, we wake up in a few years and these systems are creating really thorough answers that are pretty much always correct. Possibly, but even then, I still think the most important factor is you need a human attorney at the end of the equation to double check everything that is being output, and so that would be definitely my suggestion.
I mean, it's a really tricky balance, right, with AI's involvement in legal tech. So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think on one hand, there certainly is a lot of efficiencies that AI helps create, especially in the legal context. You can have it create a very nice and robust confidentiality clause, and it can help you save time on certain other kind of more routine and mundane tasks as a practitioner. But really that should be for the sole purpose of being able to free up the human attorney to utilize their time for more high analysis tasks, right? And I think if we kind of look at AI as kind of this tool rather than something that can actually replace the practitioner, I think that's where we're going to really extract the most value from it.
I mean, this is what we're trying to teach college kids and school kids too, right? So this is something everybody needs to learn, but it's a tricky balance for everybody. So thank you for your advice on that. So we've just touched on, the ethical responsibilities there. Let's go and talk about one of the more explosive topics, which would be privacy and security. And with AI tools digging deeper into blockchain data with privacy regulations like GDPR and CCPA tightening, the clash between transparency and privacy is very intense. So this next question is for Nick. How can AI enhance or complicate compliance with privacy regulations when dealing with blockchain data?
Sure. So, well, first I want to touch on something Rick was talking about with the hallucinations and things with the attorney. So as I said, I teach on the side. So I was building a new class last year, and I just gotten my ChatGPT subscription, and so I said, hey, build me a reading list for this specific topic in class that I was covering. And it generated it, journal, author, everything. And so I took that and I went to, I teach at NYU, I went to NYU's library to find those, and none of them were real. None of them. So the journals were real, like they were real journals. Authors were not real. The article was not real. It was not in the edition that it said it was in, or the whatever. So yeah, I had an experience like that as well. But yeah, so getting back to privacy and stuff like that. So I mean, I think when we see AI and we see the development of AI, we're seeing this like kind of bigger is better approach. So we're seeing this kind of like vacuuming of like all of digitized human knowledge, and we're kind of intaking all of that and to include blockchain. And there's a lot of like we're sort of doing it in the absence of being told what's okay and what's not. So we're just sort of, the absence of a no is a yes kind of thing. And so that's the way a lot of these companies are moving forward. And we're seeing a lot of complexities and complications from that, especially with some of the, as we know, data in transit across borders, things like that, jurisdictions that are subject to GDPR and issues and those kinds of issues. But this goes back to what I was talking about with one, kind of watching the trajectory of the policy and regulatory environment, and also kind of looking at what the future proofing of your solutions. And so I'm really glad we kind of talked about this hallucination issue, because when you have a giant AI model that's trained on the entirety of Reddit and Twitter and 4chan and all these other things, it's kind of like small wonder that you don't get super accurate results, or you get these very big broad results. And so the way that we're looking at AI in my company is actually like for these much more targeted applications, and not these big write me a sonnet on what it's like to live in Detroit or something. Like, I mean, that's cool and that's a fun thing to do, I guess, but like if you want to write a briefing or file a complaint, or if you're dealing with regulated data, you can't just kind of throw data around. And so I think that we have to think about privacy preserving in a way that is not conceptual. We need to actually think about it from the builder stage. And because, and to take this to kind of a different level, if we're going to have a kind of a geopolitical conversation about AI and where that fits in, the US as a country does not have access to nearly the data pool that China has, or Russia has, or places like that. And so if we're thinking that we're going to win or lose based on data, you might think that the US has a disadvantage. But I would argue that pushing technologies from the design phase onward that are privacy preserving, that are targeted, that are deterministic, that are truly tools that help humans and not replace humans, that's how we create real value in AI, and we preserve privacy consistent with our values.
Thank you, Nick. Really important points. And I'm going to move on to Brandon, actually, for this next one. We're going to talk about consumer protection, because this is an issue that affects every single person in this room. And with AI tools like deepfakes, the risks for fraud and deception are very real. So, the question is, how do we protect consumers in a world where AI can create very convincing fakes? So my specific question for you, Brandon, how might emerging AI-driven tools like deepfakes affect consumer protection, specifically in blockchain finance?
Great question. So first, you want to think about a wallet identity as like, this is your unique identification. Personally, I don't believe that we'll be using ID cards your driver's license for much longer. You already have to double tap on side your phone to do tap to pay. Why not just have that to be an ID? I personally believe that eventually it'll get to the point to where blockchain is incorporated into every single cell phone device, so that whenever you tap on the side, it'll be more of a safe ID. Like, it may not have your personal information as far as your address, your date of birth, and all that, but it will be able to identify that this is you. And it's a two-factor because it's on your device. And you've gone through all these processes to register this device. On top of that, the fingerprint technology does exist, and so we've had that in cell phones before, so that'll come back too. Once all that is tightened up, then blockchain is more useful in that capacity, to where even when you're posting on social media, blockchain is giving you metadata. So every single time you take a picture, every single time you drop a video, it's tagging that. It's gone through 3 steps of 3 factors of authentication, saying that this came from this person's real unique ID, quote unquote, that is attached to the blockchain. And so then anytime someone were to, let's say, screen record and then reshare, that's not tagged with that proper metadata. So it's not being identified. So let's say someone's scrolling on social media and they see it, you can maybe tap a little icon at the top and check the metadata. Nope, this didn't come from Brandon. This is not checking off those boxes.
What a brilliant use for blockchain.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
I want to piggyback on that point as well, because there's actually a really good real-world use case going on. So I sit on the New York State Bar Association's Task Force for Emerging Technology and Assets, and one of the things that's going on as a test pilot case is for utilizing blockchain metadata for police body cams, because we're seeing, and there's been some cases where, parts of maybe a police body cam video gets missing or it's altered in some sort of way, and certainly now with the advent of AI coming into the picture, you could really alter what's going on in some of these videos. And to Brandon's point, but if you're able to create a hash on a blockchain and tag that specific video at the time that it's created, you would be able to verify that against any alterations, modifications, to where you can always go back to that original video and detect what it is versus maybe possibly a duplicate or another video that's been altered. So to Brandon's point, I definitely think that use case for the technology is going to really start taking a footing really, really quickly.
I'm going to add to that as well. And the digital identity thing, I think, was such an important point that you just made. And when I was at Department of Homeland Security, we actually really kind of went down the road on looking at this, because the Real ID program is actually owned by DHS. And so that was something that we were working on. And the history here is really interesting, because your driver's license was never intended to be like an identification mechanism. And like, my parents remember when it was paper and it didn't have your picture on it and it was easily fakeable, right? And so we've gotten kind of a little bit better, but the Real ID Act was actually after September 11th, and we've only just within the last 2 years gotten to where that is actually something that's enforced. And so creating an identity that is actually fit for purpose and is meant to be an identity and is on the blockchain would be an amazing development, especially in all of the fraud that took place with the COVID Relief Act. There was a study on that said, had there been a digital identity, there would have been billions of dollars that they would have been able to kind of detect and not kind of distribute in that fraud. And so the digital identity use case is one that I'm a very big believer in, and I think is such an important application, and I hope that we can get to a place where that is something that we can get behind.
Absolutely. And actually, it reminds me of, originally, the concept of blockchain as we know it was built on a concept by Stornetto, right? And the concept of how do we verify that digital documents have never been altered. And then from that came the Bitcoin blockchain. So we're kind of really going back to that, which is fascinating. So, all right, Brandon, what role do you see for blockchain in verifying the authenticity of AI-generated content like deepfakes, and what challenges do regulators face in preventing fraud?
Yeah, so again, there are a lot of companies out here that want to sell the deepfake technology, like the voice-changing companies. There's AI for music, the video AI. There's really no way for you to be able to regulate it 100%, but someone has to hold the liability. So these companies that are putting out these products are going to have to be held liable for what they're putting out. That's the only way, because if I'm, for example, I was using ChatGPT the other day, and I asked it to create a character of the Monopoly Man for something that I was creating for a graphic. And it told me no. It said, you don't have the trademark license for this product, but if you want, I'll create something with similar likeness.
Interesting.
And I said, sure, go ahead and do that. And
Yeah.
it made the Monopoly Man. It was just, it just gave
After
me
all
the
that.
Monopoly Man.
After all that.
Yeah.
A Monopoly
So-
Man from Wish.
Yeah, but his head was a little bigger, or his mustache was a little longer.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
You know, so I think that when it comes to deep fake and regulation, as far as the time that it's going to take, it's just a matter of these companies have to know that they're liable and just hold the liability of everything. So, I mean, like my grandmother, for example, I called her and I said, if anyone calls you and says that they're me, they're not me. You have to call me back. I don't know if you guys remember back in
Smart.
the day, they used to be able to actually call you from another number and then they canceled that whole project. So I'm glad they did that. But that's a dangerous thing, because if she sees that my number is calling, that's already a flag there. But again, the blockchain incorporate into the cell phone idea is another way to kind of solve that idea. If everything just runs through that real identification system, if it has to check off all these boxes, then you could kind of alleviate some of that, because deep fake technology is not necessarily new. Like, it's just being streamlined a little bit more efficiently now. So
Absolutely, and I think there's a lot of room for specifically zero knowledge proofs to come in and help with that. So these are brilliant applications for blockchain. Thank you, Brandon.
100%.
We're going to move on to Mark for this next section. I want to talk about DAOs and legal structures just a bit. So, as DAOs evolve, do you foresee any existing legal frameworks that could be adapted to better fit decentralized autonomous organizations, or is it really entirely new laws that we need to make for it?
It's a bit of both. So we talked previously about how when a DAO is facilitating some sort of conduct, the regulators and private citizens who have allegedly been harmed by that conduct are using existing regulatory schemes and existing bodies of law to try to achieve a recovery or a modulation in the conduct. Now, at the same time, DAOs are also I can talk way over that.
Excellent.
DAOs are also facilitating new forms of justice. And I have been writing and speaking about this for several years now, and companies are starting to come into the picture to present platforms to achieve decentralized justice, such that the litigants would not need to submit their dispute to a court, would not need to have their disputes determined by judges who, in reality, many times are not as facile with some of the emerging technological trends as the folks who are subject to the judge's orders. And so DAOs as a mechanism to, at a communal level, all agree on a programmatic, self-executing, pre-wired methodology of dispute resolution is something that has a lot of promise for the community. If, for example, all of us in this room decided that coming out of this meeting we had a great idea for a concept, we could all get together and say, we're not only going to work on this concept, but if something should go wrong, here are the rules of the road around how a challenge or how a question or how a dispute is going to get sorted out. And if we all agree at an institutional level that those are going to be the governing features of any dispute resolution process, and we pre-wire it right into the self-executing computer code, that's the way it's going to be. And so that is an example, to your question, Elizabeth, of how there is a fusion of both existing principles, but also it's not just a risk area. This is an area of opportunity. These technologies are giving us the ability to take justice into our own hands, not in a vigilante way, but in a self-empowering way that has a lot of promise for both the country as a whole, the world as a whole, and then each siloed community based on their own parameters and preferences.
Thank you, Mark. This next question is for Brandon. Specifically in terms of governance and decision-making, how do you think AI-driven DAOs could revolutionize the digital art space?
Horribly,
Boo.
to be honest.
Really? Why do you say that? I'm so curious.
It's dangerous. So here's the thing. Let's say that you allow AI to represent you as a person.
Okay.
That's essentially what this looks like. Otherwise, you have all these AI characters that are just voting on behalf of no one, that are just making decisions. So essentially,
Yeah.
you could spin up an entity and send it out into the world and let AI just, and it's like, oh, I'm not responsible. That was the AI. So then what? But if you allow it to represent your likeness, let's say you have to go through some sort of programming to where it's like, okay, you put your answers, this is me, this is how I would respond to this, here are my viewpoints, here's my stance, I'm red, I'm blue, I'm whatever. And then, yeah, okay, so if I'm not present, if there's a deadline, I need to be able to vote on this in order for my vote to count by this date, go ahead and just opt into the AI. If I don't vote on this matter by this date, the AI will take over on my behalf. Whatever the answer is, I'm happy with.
Yeah, and it's tricky because, it's the issue of you don't know what biases they're going to use in making those decisions, right? So we've touched on that a little bit. So very interesting to hear your perspective. Thanks for sharing that.
For sure.
All right, so we've covered everything from compliance to consumer protection, and we've explored the legal frameworks shaping AI and blockchain, but now we're stepping into the future. So blockchain and AI, they are shaping the future in ways that we can barely imagine. And the choices being made right now will really have a big impact. So let's talk to Nick about where these technologies are headed and what that means for the world stage. My first question for you is, given your experience in advising on emerging technologies and geopolitics, how do you see AI shaping the global balance of power?
Well, you can go to any number of speeches, documents, things like that from a lot of different leaders and countries around the world. And, Vladimir Putin said that, the one who leads in AI is going to rule the world. And you look at some of the China's 5-year plans and Made in China 2025 and these different documents, they all reference data and AI as a kind of a geopolitical lever. And then you look at some of the things that are going on with state-sponsored intellectual property theft. And so we're seeing as not hiding, as a public matter, we're seeing China do things that are specifically targeting kind of these early stage developers who have these new innovative ideas, who are not prepared to kind of defend against a cyber attack of that sophistication. And so what we've entered is an era that is really defined by emerging tech, AI being obviously a central part of that. And so, we in previous eras we had, kind of eras dominated by non-state actors. We had the Cold War, we had, things like this where we all sort of knew what the geopolitical landscape was made up of. Now it's really built around emerging technology. It's the R&D, the operationalization, the monetization of these emerging technologies, but they're also instruments of state power. And so this goes back to the convergence conversation from earlier. AI, we can do a lot of different things on the kind of national security, homeland security stage with AI. It's not AI alone, but it's AI integrated into something else, converging with something else. And so I think that one of the things that raises my alarm bells for me is the intellectual property theft issue, because we're seeing it in terms of cyber attacks, we're seeing it by live people being sent here, and that competition, that's the new kind of geostrategically valuable commodity that we're competing over, and we're seeing there's a lot more to this, but we're seeing state-sponsored activities against this, and they're particularly targeting those kind of like small early stage companies and developers, because they're the ones that have the innovative ideas. And so it's no longer kind of sufficient to say, well, I'm just somebody in my garage, tuning up my new NFT protocol or whatever. You have to think that, no, you have something that's valuable and you might be a target. And so it's important to kind of understand that what you're building does have that implication as well.
So do you think that AI could become some sort of arms race between nations, similar to what we saw with nuclear weapons?
Yeah, and in a sense it is. But I go back to I think one, we have to talk about kind of what do you need to be good at AI. So you need data. We talked about that earlier. You also need compute, right? And you need things to integrate it into. And so there's arms races kind of around, I would say, those first two already. So compute, data, you have to have the workforce for it, right? You have to have people that can do it. There's absolutely kind of a race around that. And so, like, I would hesitate to use the term kind of arms race because that sounds very militaristic, and that's not, I think, the right way to kind of think about it. But I do think we're seeing a race for dominance in what will be an instrument of national power. And so AI will absolutely be that, but I would put some other technologies in that category as well, like quantum computing, for example, would also be an instrument of state power, potentially more impactful even than AI.
So do you see governments actually coming together to collaborate, especially in terms of compliance and enforcement? That would seem so tricky across borders.
So you do see governments coming together, but on the compliance issue, my experience is we're usually pretty far apart on a lot of those conversations. And so when I was at DHS, the EU AI Act was being kind of shopped around, and every time we had a meeting with a minister from some country, they wanted the talking point in there that we should tell them that the EU AI Act is bad. And after a while, it was like, do you think they're listening to us? They're not, right? That's their sovereign law, right? We're not going to tell them how to write their sovereign law. And so we were really far apart on that because there's some pretty big ideological differences. But I think there are not fundamental and values-based differences. That I think we do share. And to me, if we share that, we can get somewhere. And the example I'll give is the EU AI Act calls any use of AI by a law enforcement agency high risk. And so DHS, being the biggest federal law enforcement agency in the country, would push back on that pretty hard. But that is something we can come to, we can figure out how to come together on something like that. But as long as we believe that building it within our shared democratic values, protection of privacy, things like that, which despite some of the fights, we actually do share that. But we take very different approaches to it.
So, yeah, please.
I just want to kind of add on to Nick's point as well, and kind of zooming out a little bit. I don't know if anybody in here has ever played the Metal Gear Solid video game series, but in Metal Gear Solid 2, which, by the way, came out in 2001, there's a conversation, and it's gone viral on YouTube multiple times over the years because of just how much of a stark picture it actually ended up creating of how our AI systems and social media systems are today. And to Nick's point is, so in the game itself, it talks about that how a lot of businesses and high-level governments eventually started to become ran by AI systems themselves. And in a way that supposedly, at least according if you ask the AI in this context, is kind of our gatekeepers, right? They look out for our best interests. They realize what's best for us as a society and as a species. But what you quickly realize is they really did not have our best interests in mind because in a lot of ways, human beings sometimes don't have our own best interests in mind. And so we have to be very mindful of, as AI continues to grow and to scale, there's a story, I think it was in Japan, where a company has its CEO as a AI bot system. And so I think as we kind of grow and expand, and there's kind of this tug and pull, as Nick kind of talks about, of regulation coming in, but still allowing for these systems to grow and thrive. It's just something to be kind of mindful and careful of, especially on a cross-jurisdictional basis. So just want to throw in that tidbit as well.
Thank you, Rick. And this is my last question for you, Nick, and the last question of the evening before we do a Q&A. So just briefly, this is maybe a bit of more of a curiosity, but you advise the White House, right, on national security implications of AI and emerging technologies. And these are national security risk is obviously a major focus for policymakers. So can you share with us maybe some of the most surprising or even unsettling risks that AI could pose to national security in the next decade?
Yeah, and I think when this question is asked, there's frequently, people will go to kind of the traditional hard military power sort of application, right? The autonomous AI swarm that's going to, attack the Navy ship or something like that. And that stuff's true. And I don't mean to kind of belittle the autonomous weapons part of this. But I mean, I think that if we look at just the damage that we've seen, especially to our country, I think it's in the spread of misinformation. And I think that's the thing. If you look at a lot of what's going on, we're doing a lot of things to ourselves, and it's really a result of the ability to create, generate, and distribute false information that we have a hard time kind of not, disbelieving. And so it's really created, like, we have now a bad relationship, or a kind of a rocky relationship with the truth. And it used to be, if I put, like, let's say a written letter in front of you, and like, how do you know that it was from me? Well, you would need to know my signature or something like that, or have some reasonable confidence that like somebody didn't forge it. If you heard my voice, you could probably assume it was me. I mean, maybe you could be mistaken. Maybe there's somebody that can do a good impression of me, although I don't know why someone would work on that. But but there was some doubt there. But if you saw me, like if you saw a video of me, a picture of me or something like that, it used to be we could say, that's definitely, yep, Nick was definitely in Detroit on that night, right? But we've even taken that away now. We don't have confidence in visual anymore. We don't have confidence in audio. We don't have confidence in written. And so what's left? What's left when we need to gather information, about something like an upcoming election, or even a technology capability or something like that? What's left? And so I think that the thing that's been the most damaging is the distribution and creation of misinformation, and then what it has kind of created and what we've sort of done to ourselves as a result.
Excellent answer. Thank you for sharing your insights. And I'd like to open this up to the audience for a Q&A. And I think if you just use a nice loud voice, we'll be able to hear you. I might reiterate it for the microphones, but I also have some prizes to encourage participation. I have a Web3 book from Alex Tapscott. He is a bestseller. I have a chain link t-shirt. And so if anybody wants to raise their hands.
I'll go.
Yeah.
See any other hands up. So back to geopolitical risks that you were discussing. I was wondering, what is being conceived of or discussed as far as making sure that AI kind of like spits out the answers that we find amenable? You can see a situation, I'm going to use China as an example, where it uses all its data, and the last thing the Chinese government wants is for when someone types in the question in Baidu ChatGPT, what is the best form of government? And it spits out multi-party, representative democracy. So in that guise, what is being already discussed, conceived of to make safeguards that make sure that the questions and answers that we're getting are amenable to our society and beneficial?
Well, I think what I would amend that just a little bit to say, I don't think I wouldn't say it's amenable as in something we like, but it's, again, going back to that kind of like relationship with the truth. Like, we can believe that what is coming out is a truthful response based on the data that is trained on, right? Like, that's the thing we want. And that is kind of the pursuit of deterministic AI. And so when you ask, if we opened up ChatGPT right now and we asked it a question and it gave us a question, and then we asked it the same question again, we would not get the exact same response. Or same thing with an image. If we wanted it to create an image, it would not create the same image twice. And that's because it's not deterministic, right? It's probabilistic. And so what we need to do is have AI that, not for a ChatGPT, application, it's fine, but for a lot of these, kind of more targeted cases, legal cases, regulatory, national security, things like that, you need deterministic AI. And so that is one way that we can start to get, from a technical perspective, that we can start to get toward that. Another one is governance, and this is something that I could talk about for a long time because we did this at DHS, but creating a governance structure that kind of asks the right questions and has the right controls in place. So auditability, transparency of data, being able to go back and explain kind of how the algorithm got to where it is. Those are things that are achievable. And those are things we should put in place. And our governance structure should be asking the right question, which is not, can I use AI, right? Like it's a laptop or a phone, but should I use AI for this application? And if yes, under what conditions? And then it is empowered to put the conditions in place to then govern what we're seeing. And so I think those are the ways that we get toward that. And the governance piece is very forward in the minds of government folks, but still it is still developing.
Thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate that. And I'm going to actually give the microphone, yeah, it is portable. Great. If you want to step up here for just a second.
Yeah.
So that the recording picks it up.
Oh, okay. So I got a question about, sorry, SO2 or SOC2 compliance. So like you're talking about data governance. So I'm wondering like, yes, that there's traceability. Like you have trace, you could do trace when you make requests, and so you could track it through the algorithm. But my question is SOC2 compliance. What's missing in data governance and AI? Like, compliance, of course.
Compliance-wise.
Yeah, so I think it is, it's about, provenance of data. I think, kind of understanding the initial state of the data set that you've got. And then, the security protocols around, when the AI reaches into that lake of data, what occurs, what security protocols are around that protocol, or around that action. And so, I mean, I think there are a few things that are missing, because as we are dealing with bigger and bigger data lakes and we are analyzing them in different ways, we have to amend things like SOC 2. And so I think that is something that we'll continue to see evolve. And I think one of the things that has really, I guess, made this more important is some of the debates about what the bigger, kind of the big box AI companies are doing. Like Facebook was literally going to buy a publishing house just to get more data to put into their large language model. And so looking at things like that and understanding the volume of data, you can make a really good argument that our kind of governance or security or risk protocols around data are actually outdated and maybe not useful. And so you bring up a great point about, trying to bring that into alignment. And then from that, you would see changes probably to regulatory regimes as well.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question. Yep.
We'll do two. We'll just try to get the answer first. Thank you. So I often like to say privacy is like a window, and I hear you with the real ID, but also maintaining our privacy. So how do we navigate that moving forward? I know that's kind of an open-ended question, but.
That's a great question. Brandon?
Great question. So I feel like if you have any sort of social media with your picture on it, you're already out of the loop on that. Facebook, yeah, okay. Facebook, Instagram. I don't believe that decentralization is for everything. There are also centralized blockchain platforms that are very useful. And I think that for something like this, that would be useful for that use case.
All right. We have one other question in the back. Actually, can you step up to the microphone? I want to make sure the recording can pick up your voice. Thank you, Brandon.
So I'm in blockchain technology in terms of real estate, right? And utilizing that. I know that you're attorneys, lawyers, right? I wanted to ask questions in regards to how you perceive regulation surrounding that in particular, right? How regulation is proceeding from your perspective in terms of blockchain integrating with real estate and other innovations in terms of that industry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when we talk about RWAs and integrating blockchain technology into existing paradigms like real estate and maybe perhaps other security instruments, I think the tough part is, at least with real estate in particular, is we have so many different existing regulatory frameworks at both the state and the federal level that you have to abide by with real estate, that even if the technology itself work, which, look, in the context of real estate, the main idea is to create liquidity for traditional assets that are traditionally illiquid, right? And even if you can obviously solve that and you can create liquidity, which again I don't think the industry is really even to that point yet, but let's say even if you could, the regulations behind it really stipulate that in most circumstances, like if you tried to fractionalize a piece of real estate, those pieces that you fractionalize are now securities, which really here in the US, you have accredited investor laws that basically stipulate that unless you are an accredited investor, you really can't participate in the buying and selling of these fractionalized securities, which If you think about it, obviously blockchain, the whole point of it is to create liquidity, to create larger marketplaces for more market participants, right? But you have to obviously balance that with consumer protection. But at the root of it, I would say the technology is there, but there's external market factors as well as existing regulatory regimes that unfortunately I think are not necessarily allowing it to thrive at this stage. Yeah.
With you knowing that about the credit investors, there's things like the new market credit taxes, right? To give credit investors 39% tax credit to invest in affordable housing and different things like that, right? And then you think about concepts like the Job Act, right? That Obama passed in 2008 that gives consumers the ability to crowdsource. How does that change your perspective on those things, knowing that those things are actually in place? And the fact that there's decentralized technology that makes those things come together.
Yeah, I definitely think, for myself, I'm of the opinion that I think it's great that we have more ways for people in the marketplace to participate in investments. It's interesting, we have, in one hand, the ability for people to gamble away their life savings on a football game, but when it comes to, buying stock in a company, we have a lot of gatekeeping mechanisms in place. And I think it seems really counterintuitive. And I think, in my opinion, a lot of the laws that we have in place really should be more focused on investor education levels and how well they understand the risks of investments and things like that, instead of it just being currently kind of more of a high, of a net worth test, right? I know some of the smartest people that I know when it comes to investing, they probably wouldn't qualify as an accredited investor, but they're absolutely brilliant. So I definitely think, a lot of these regulatory frameworks should at least be at minimum tweaked. Again, you have to have some protections in place for consumers, but we definitely need a little bit of changing as well. Mark, any thoughts on this as well?
Very briefly, so you brought up Reg CF, and I think there is sometimes a misperception in the community that Reg CF can be done in an extraordinarily streamlined way. I was on the phone with a client over the weekend and they were telling me how expensive even doing a Reg CF was. So it's kind of ironic when even the systems that are supposed to be more simplified still have a high degree of complexity. The one other potential hack or workaround in the real estate context in particular is if you could structure, this is in part jumping off the question, in part jumping off your comment, Rick, but if you could structure a fractionalized interest in real estate where the appreciation was going to have nothing to do with any active management, but was just going to be a function of pure market appreciation, that might be a function where you could get around some of the existing securities constraints. Am I inviting a follow-up?
Well, I was just going to say to your point, Mark, that some of the issues that kind of crop up with kind of crafting these solutions is a lot of times you have to have, owner-occupied housing. And obviously if you have, a fractionalized piece of real estate with 100, owners, you can't have 100 people living in a house. So, and that's kind of what to my earlier point was, is that there's so many different rules and regulations in place that really unfortunately are just kind of prohibitive of allowing, the use case of this technology that, and really to Mark's point, could really, create some really new innovative financial instruments to come into the fold. But it kind of prevents that from happening, at least currently. But, I'm optimistic and hopeful that things will change.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. And, I wanted to host this event because as a builder in this space, I've come to realize how critical it is that we have policies that are working to maintain blockchain's decentralized nature. The choices that we are making today about AI and blockchain regulation aren't just about technology. They're truly about power. Global power, national security, personal sovereignty, and the fundamental rights of individuals. And at the heart of this struggle is decentralization. And this isn't just a feature. Decentralization is not just a feature, it is the foundation of freedom. Decentralization means no single entity controls the future of finance, identity, or innovation. It means empowering billions around the world, not a handful of gatekeepers. If we surrender this, we risk a world where control is centralized, where freedom is a luxury, and where innovation becomes the privilege of the powerful. The stakes are high, and that's why conversations like tonight are so critically important. So thank you for spending this evening with us. This was really enjoyable. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you to our fascinating panel of experts for sharing your insights. I'd like to give you a round of applause. I'd also like to thank those who are listening from our live stream. Thank you for joining us tonight. I really hope you enjoyed the evening. And if anyone is ever interested in participating in an Ethereum meetup with me, please reach out, and I would love to collaborate. Thank you very much.